Now back to tonight's other big story, and it's a major one, the Jim Comey memos. Now, we now know what's in those memos, and now the Justice Department watchdog also knows what's in those memos, and now he wants to investigate whether two of them have leaked classified information on the inside of them when he gave some of those memos to his good buddy at Columbia just uptown here, who was at the Justice Department. Fox News Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge is trying to stay up with this, but man, this book tour is getting quite interesting, isn't it, Catherine?
It is, Brian, and thank you. Fox News confirms that Comey is under investigation by the Justice Department's internal watchdog, the Inspector General, for leaking the memos, whether he mishandled classified information, as well as his communications outside the FBI, including reporters. The memos show the relationship between the president and Comey was difficult from the very beginning, after Comey briefed Mr. Trump about the dossier's unverified claims just 3 weeks before the inauguration. Those who support the president say the memos show he wanted the Russia claims investigated. With Comey writing, the president said it would be good to find out, but that he hadn't done anything and hoped I would find a way to get out that we weren't investigating him. President's critics say another memo shows he crossed the line when he talked with Comey about a loyalty pledge. Comey wrote, I replied that he would always get honesty from me. Trump paused and said, that's what he wants, honest loyalty. I replied, you will get that from me. Of the 15 pages of memos, 8 contained classified information at the secret, which is highly sensitive, or confidential level. And that seems to be at odds with Comey's congressional testimony after he was fired.
My thinking was, if I write it in such a way that I don't include anything that would trigger a classification, that'll make it easier for us to discuss within the FBI and the government, and to hold on to it in a way that makes it accessible to us.
But in this very first memo in January of 2017, Comey knew his conversations with the president were sensitive and not public information. I am not sure of the proper classification here, he wrote, so have chosen secret. Please let me know if it should be higher or lower than that. So tonight we have a serious investigation by the Inspector General at the Justice Department and another apparent conflict between the documents and Comey's testimony, Brian.
And it's, you know, you can't say this is political or President Trump's DOJ. It's an Inspector General appointed by President Obama, correct?
That's correct. That's correct.
Catherine, great job. You make it sound so simple, but yet we know it's really complicated.
I appreciate that. Okay.
Meanwhile, straight ahead, have a great weekend, Catherine. Comey spoke about leaking the memos during the interview with George Stephanopoulos earlier this week. You know, the interview that never ended? Take a look.
The president's tweeted innumerable times calling you a leaker. Well, what's your response to President Trump?
Look, it's true. I mean, I'm the one who testified about it. That's how people know about it. I gave that unclassified memo to my friend and asked him to give it to a reporter. That is entirely appropriate.
Really? In what world? The Wall Street Journal's editorial board member, Kim Strassel, one of her latest columns she talked about the questions that she wants James Comey to answer. First off, is it right for him to have leaked that memo? And his reasoning is bizarre. He says, I needed to get the information into the public square. What is this, 1778?
Yeah, hi, Brian. And no, of course it's not appropriate. This is a man who has nailed to the wall numerous people from his perch at the FBI for having mishandled classified information, for leaking. He talks in his memos about how he tells President Trump he wants to go after the leakers, make an example of them. And just because Jim Comey decided that he was entitled to take these documents, which arguably, by the way, are FBI property, they were in his possession, and then decide that he alone is entitled for the public interest to leak. Everyone who leaks has some sort of motivation like this, and it doesn't justify what he did.
He had 4 memos out. 2 of them they're taking another look at. Meanwhile, his deputy, Andy McCabe, clearly is in trouble. He told multiple lies, so he's going to be skewered. We're going to find out if the criminal referral will result in charges. But looking at Comey in particular, I have a little problem. For example, his pull-aside in the Oval Office. That is very similar to the pull-aside in Trump Tower. If you have a new person into politics who's used to running a major organization and wants to have a confidential conversation, if you know more about how it's done, how about this, Jim Comey? Instead of jotting it down after you leave, hey, Mr. President, no offense, I'm sure you don't realize I shouldn't really be one-on-one with you. Let's get somebody else in the room for your own, just so you don't have a problem later. There are so many ways to avoid the problem. Instead, we hear about the voice in his head, and he writes in longhand, and we eventually get a best-selling book.
There does seem to be almost a sense of entrapment in these memos, as though he was urging the president to do things so that he could then run back outside and write down the bad things the president had done in his mind. And by the way, the double standard here too, Brian, I think is glaringly evident. Jim Comey tells us in his book and on this tour about the doubts he had about Loretta Lynch and her judgment, some of the orders she gave him. But do we have any conversations between him and her that were memorialized? Absolutely not. So, I mean, and there's a lot of other things that come out of this memo too. I think we're finding as well that Jim Comey, he likes to talk about how he's just a facts guy. But again, only the facts that matter. And once we're seeing the context of a lot of these statements that have been wafting around in the press for the last year, it turns out there's a very different reading of this than the one that only Jim Comey was giving us up until now.
It's unbelievable. I just think that if he had any brains in his head, one interview and get off the stage. The more he talks, the more news unfolds, the more he backs himself into a corner. And now his battles with Andy McCabe, because they both can't be telling the truth.